Hello, everyone. If you can hear me, it would be great if you could just give me a hey in the chat so I can make sure that everybody can hear me and that everyone who's joining us is here and that it's clear. Can folks hear me? Okay. Hey, Melanie Morrison. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. My name is Ebony Howard. I am the executive director for the Wallace Center for Arts and Reconciliation, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here with you today for the Wallace Center's first ever webinar. Also, our first time using this wonderful streaming service called StreamYard. So, hopefully it goes well. Fingers crossed. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Wallace Center in case you don't know. The Wallace Center is a descendant-led organization that's dedicated to healing and racial reconciliation. It was founded by the descendants of people who were enslaved on the Wallace Plantation in Harpersville, Alabama, along with the descendants of the slave holders. These two groups of people came together with the mission of preserving their shared history, but also grappling with conversations about race in America to make a more equitable future. As I said, this is the Wallace Center's first ever webinar. It's also a part of our newest exhibit, Out of Whole Cloth, Marking History and Making Home, 1865 to 1910. This exhibit explores the lives of three families who lived on the Wallace Plantation after emancipation and talks about their journey to make a life as they encountered new struggles. At the end of the webinar, I'll actually share with you how you can come see the exhibit if you're in Alabama or traveling to Alabama. But before we do that, we want to hear from our wonderful guests today who are going to have a robust and beautiful conversation about the very subject in the exhibit. So I'm going to do a super brief introduction of each of them so we can really jump into it. The first person is our moderator and dear friend of the Wallace Center, Eliza Gaddis. Elijah is the Holyfield Associate Professor of Southern History and co-director of the Human Histories Workshop at Auburn University, where he is also an affiliate faculty in Africana Studies. His work focuses on the spatial, material, and cultural histories of the 19th and 20th century. Elijah is going to be having a discussion today with two other wonderful scholars. The first one is Eliza Jane Franklin, who is a self-proclaimed Southern Belle radical. Her work focuses on heritage lynching and heritage lynching sites and provides a framework for understanding the systemic erasure and control of cultural heritage across landscapes, artifacts, and cultural forms. Eliza Jane has a BA in African American Studies and a master's in urban planning from UCLA, a master's in heritage conservation at USC, and a forthcoming history PhD from Auburn. Accomplished, very accomplished. Our third panelist that we're so excited to have is Dr. Rinaldo Walcott. Rinaldo is a professor and Carl G. Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies and Chair of the Department of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. He researches the cultural expression of Black life, focusing on transnational, diasporic, and national cross currents of Black creativities. He also has a book coming out and has written on several subjects that I hope he'll tell you about during the course of this conversation. And with that, I'm going to jump back out and allow our panelists to lead the way. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ebony, and thanks, Eliza Jane and Rinaldo, for being here, and all of you, whoever is out there. So yeah, I'm gonna try to be less verbose than usual, but I do want to sort of set us in two kind of particular contexts for the start of this conversation. The one is I think emancipation more broadly, right? And we are going to try to span sort of transtemporal. We're going to try to go through a bunch of chronologies today as we think about emancipation. But I think I want to start just really briefly by commenting on what I think folks in the United States, right, often think about when we think of emancipation. And we are often sort of stuck with thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, which goes into effect for some enslaved people, right, in at the beginning of 1863, or we think about the various emancipation orders and the ways in which they reach enslaved folks in 1865, going all the way up to, right, at least Juneteenth. Um, uh, but I think it is also, right, and we'll get into this today, right, thinking about emancipation as this experience that was variable, and this experience that does not happen all at once, and this experience that does not happen to Black folk, right, but which they bring about, and which in many ways scholars now think of in the way that Black folk did at the time, right, which is this liberatory emancipation that they themselves brought about, right? So being free rather than being freed. So that context I think is important, as we'll sort of start from that sort of United States standpoint and sort of go far afield from there, I hope. And then the other connection, the other sort of context that I want to just put us in is the one that Ebony sort of started with, right? Which is the context of this exhibit, which we are thinking about as we're kind of going into its launch here in a week or so. And this is an exhibit, right, that tries to do in many ways what we are doing today, right? It tries to think about what happens at this sort of moment of emancipation and after, right? And what it looks like, not just to have that emancipation, but to have freedom, right? To forge those kind of freedoms over a couple of generations. And specifically, what the exhibit looks at are three families, right? The Baker Datcher family of Creswell, North Carolina, descendants of the Wallace plantation, other plantations. The McGinnis family, descended from plantations around Vincent, Harpersville, Shelby County area, including the Wallace Plantation, Alabama, and a third sort of family that we referred to as the unknown ancestors, a collection of these amazing 1870s and 1880s photographs that were held by a local family and are of formerly enslaved people. But we don't have their sort of larger identities. So very much thinking throughout the exhibit about what emancipation and that sort of next two generations looks like for these folks as well, and how we begin to sort of tell these stories of people for whom we don't have kind of conventional historical evidence, right? So thinking very much about how history can be something that is both evidentiary, right, but is also very much rooted in these ideas of invention, of creativity, of expression, right? So anyway, with those contexts sort of laid out, maybe longer than they needed to be, I want to jump into the first question that we're going to talk about today, and I want to sort of put us in yet another sort of context related to Alabama, but related maybe to Alabama and its broad sort of transatlantic connections. And I'm thinking specifically here about Zora Neale Hurston's Bear Coon, which many folks will know was published a few years ago, and it, as a posthumous, we should say, posthumously, and really sort of is a transcription of this ethnographic engagement, the series of interviews that Alabama native Zora Neale Hurston had with Cudjoe Lewis. Cudjoe Lewis being a descendant, or not a descendant of, but one of the very last people brought over from Africa directly to Alabama on the slave ship Clotilda. And there's so much in the book, right? It's such a generative text. But one of the things that that Mr. Lewis really thinks about and really focuses on and talks about with Zora Neale Hurston, right, is that moment after emancipation, right? And he's thinking about both these sort of possibilities and these limitations, right? He's thinking about his imagination of what he wants to do and what he wants this moment to mean and what it can actually be, right? So he's thinking about he wants to return to Africa, but he's not able to for a number of reasons. And so he and others form Africa Town. He names his children, right? These African-based names, but then they go by these American names. And so, you know, there is this sort of push and pull very much back and forth. And it makes me really think, as I'm reading the book and sort of thinking about it afterwards, and the three of us, or really the four of us, talked a bit about this before. What is it that newly emancipated people had to think about as the Civil War is ending and they're entering into emancipation? I mean, I think there are the obvious things, like they're thinking about, what am I going to do for work? Where am I going to live? But what are the other sort of considerations here? How are they beginning to, say, build institutions, community, whatever? Yeah, I'd love for y'all to sort of take this question wherever you'd like, and whichever one of you wants to begin, please do.
Well, I think for me, when we talk about emancipation and its occurrence, and we think about newly freed folks, and I use that term loosely, right? When we think about having autonomy over one's mind and body, and just your social status in society. And when we discuss emancipation, what comes to my mind always is liberation, right? Emancipation versus liberation. And emancipation focuses on the freedom of identity, the freedom to be who you are, which I think in this country, Black folks and abroad have never been truly emancipated, right? Versus liberation, which is really focused around a self-determination that exists, right? To really come into oneself. And so thinking of liberation as a spatial practice and how Black folks had to envision what would their life be post their enslavement, it's really this initiative that had already began before their bodies received this so-called freedom through this document of the Emancipation Proclamation. So often, you know, when we talk about the spirituals, the hymns that carried these Black folks into their freedom in their minds and in their way of living, that's why I think the words of Barracoon are so powerful, right? Because in that, through his words, he emancipated himself, right? We're able to really see the ways in which he lived, even when he was enslaved. And so for me, I don't think that emancipation truly began for Black folks with the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Reclaiming their autonomy in regards to being able to make something out of nothing with the foods that were given to us and the various things is something that was already being done. So they were already liberated in that sense. But yes, when we talk about post-emancipation, I think that something that was elevated to folks' mind are, how am I going to keep my family together, right? How am I going to keep my community together? If we decide to leave this place that we have been forced to call home. I think when we elevate Barracoon and we talk about Africa Town, that is a prime example that shows you that folks were in the mind state of community, right? Not this notion of I and me once they were free. And so they received their individual freedom, but it was a collective freedom that I think that they were focused on. And that's why we see things such as the Freedmen and, HBCUs drawing out of that, and all of these various things that grew out of emancipation.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I think Eliza raised some really important points. And I want to go back to um, Cudjoe Lewis, because I think Cudjoe Lewis is a really interesting figure to
Mm-hmm.
begin a conversation about emancipation with,
Yes.
because Cudjoe Lewis would have had a sense or a different sense of freedom before he was enslaved.
Right.
Unlike in some instances, folks who were born into the peculiar institution
Mm-hmm.
and had never lived outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time juridical or legislative emancipation, as I like to call it, happened,
Mm-hmm.
he would be able, through the way in which he named his children and so on, to recall a time when he was not captive.
Right.
And he could work from that. But for so many of us, our ancestors, we come from ancestors
Mm-hmm.
who could not remember a time when they were not captive. So the two figures that for me in the historiography of transatlantic slavery loom large around this question of the tension between freedom and emancipation is Cudjoe Lewis, and we're so thankful that Hurston was able to record his story,
Mm-hmm.
and Equiano, Olado Equiano, who was also captured as a young boy and spent basically all of his captivity attempting to be free again or uncaptured. I'm going to use the term uncaptured. And that is really quite important for us to think with, because I think it casts a light on the limits of legislative and juridical emancipation. That what they help us to see is that even when slavery formally ended, or even when the slave was able to become an ex-slave, as in Equiano's case, that a logic of captivity still framed their lives. So we know that when slavery ended in many parts of the US, of what now constitutes the US, in many parts of the Caribbean, the English speaking Caribbean, in particular, the British colonies, that one of the things that many of the formerly enslaved did was to get up and walk off of those plantations.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they could get away from those plantations, they tried to get as far away from them as they could, try to set up autonomous communities, try to begin to build their own institutions, churches, schools, and so on. So the kind of question of trying to get into the minds, the thinking of the formerly enslaved right after emancipation is to begin to work at the tensions between an emancipation that is given and the former slaves trying to author for themselves what freedom would mean and look like. And in every instance after emancipation, that the former slaves tried to author what freedom and liberation would look like for them, the forces of white supremacy came knocking on their doors. They
Right.
brought in all kinds of laws, vagrancy laws. They brought in restrictions on what kinds of economic resources that the former slaves could have access to, forcing some of them back onto the plantations to work. In some cases, like in the Caribbean, they tried to totally displace them by bringing in Indian and Chinese indenture ships to replace them and make them non-existent and useless. So the question of emancipation is one that is fraught with so many complications, so many political maneuvering, that the one thing that we can be certain of is that the day after any emancipation proclamation was a day for which the now formerly enslaved engaged in a new set of struggles.
So I have so many, the fun thing about moderating these things is that I can only partially react, right? I have so many things to say to all this, but we will have conversations offline. But I do want to sort of follow up on what I feel like is something that both of you brought up, right? And we so often think, both in a sort of scholarly sense and I think from a sort of community historical aspect, right? We so often think about emancipation as akin to other things, right? As akin to liberation, as akin to freedom. And I think both of you made this really, really important distinction actually between what emancipation is or looks like versus freedom, liberation, however else we want to sort of call it. And so I wanted both of y'all to sort of comment on that and think about how, and this is really, I think, a question of imagination, right? How we can sort of imagine, both us now as scholars, writers, thinkers, artists, whatever, how we can imagine something bigger, more capacious, more liberatory than emancipation, and maybe also how folk at the time, right, were thinking about this, right, beyond emancipation towards freedom, liberation, whatever. So yeah, I'd love to, Eliza Jane, if you have thoughts on this to start, I'll put you on the spot. I know Rinaldo has written basically a whole book on this, so we'll start if that's okay.
Well, I'm reminded of Sadia Hartman when she talks about legal emancipation. And I think that's really the terminology to be used or utilized as we discuss emancipation. And I want to elevate again this freedom, that Black folks already had. And, when we talk about the Igbo, right, which many of the enslaved persons who were in chattel slavery in the United States derived from this lineage, right? They would engage in practices where they would, essentially disassociate, right? Or even, utilize suicide as a means to disconnect from having their personhood be subjected, right, to the inhumanity that was associated with enslavement. And I want to elevate what Rinaldo was saying about this knowing that Cujo Lewis had in knowing what freedom felt like, right? And he was not an anomaly, but he is a specific individual whom we can look to do a comparison and a contextualization of the various mindsets, because it was not, when people talk about the enslavement of bodies, and then when we talk about this legal emancipation, we like to talk about it in the sense of a monolith, right? And that is not what it was, right? Each plantation setting had a different enslaver, right? A different environment, a different set of folks. Just so many dynamics were different in each locality. And so I think in thinking about that, it really elevates this notion of not allowing ourselves to fall into giving all of this generosity to legal emancipation, right? Instead of honoring those persons who were enslaved in their ways of knowing to navigate around that. Like, I really want to elevate that. And Dr. Corrida Brown has a really good book out right now, and it's called The Battle for the Black Mind. And really what enslavement was about was not just, we focus on the physicality, right? But it was really to enslave our minds. When we look back to roots, right? And just the ways in which Alex Haley's descendant was attempted to be forced, right? To recall an identity and a name that was not his, right? That speaks to the mindset of those who knew freedom before the legal emancipation, and the strength that they brought that was infectious to those who had been born in enslavement.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo what Eliza said. First, let me say I wrote this little book called The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Black Freedom. And in that book, very much deeply influenced by Saidiya Hartman's work from Scenes of Subjection, I really work hard at trying to make the distinction between what I called earlier um, juridical and legislative emancipation, which is those proclamations that say on such and such a date, you will no longer be a slave,
Right.
but you might be an apprentice, as happened in the British Caribbean, and so on, for another 7 years. So what then becomes freedom, right? And so because people so often use the term emancipation as synonymous with freedom, what I was trying to do in that book is to clear some ground for a different account of freedom. So of course the body can be made captive,
Right.
and the psychology can be made captive, but part of the struggle for freedom is to push back against that. So when Marcus Garvey wrote of emancipating yourself from mental slavery, that Bob Marley made so famous in his song, we begin to see what's at stake in terms of thinking about the tension and the difference between emancipation and freedom. Or when who just passed away 2 days ago, the now late Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote his book Decolonizing the Mind. Or we think about the work of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. Um, we know that the question of freedom is something about bodily autonomy. It's something about being able to um, make claims about how you live in the world, um, and so on. And so, you know, the slave's body might have been captive, but the totality of the slave could never be captured. And this is why, of course, you had uprisings. This is why, of course, you had rebellions. And this is why, of course, from 1791 to 1804, Haitians fought a war of rebellion and revolution in which they eventually won, defeating Napoleon's armies and declaring themselves a multiracial republic in 1804. A republic that has been since blockade and so on, pushing it constantly to the brink of demise, but never fallen into demise. Haitians are tremendously resilient. I hate that word, but it's the only word I can think of now. People. All of this is to get at the fact that one of the things the Black people in the Americas, but in the US in particular, have struggled with is the limit of that legislative, juridical, legal emancipation. It is indeed a limit. And part of what I try to argue in my own work is that we actually still live in the time of emancipation, and that time of emancipation is long, and that our ongoing struggles to arrive at some question of freedom, to arrive at liberation, to arrive at a full autonomy of what it means to live in this world keeps being encumbered by this legislative emancipation. So we're still in the struggle
Yes.
to make legislative emancipation disappear and dissolve into something that is much more buoyant, something that is much more enriching for Black lives. So I'll give this last example and then I'll shut up. Much of the kind of police violence that organizes Black life in North America, whether it's in the US or Canada, is a part of this long emancipation. It's a part of the entire juridical legislative system of holding Black people in place. Police violence is a part of that logic that tells us, quote, we're free, but we're not really free. And so this is the work that having a more robust understanding of what emancipation is can allow us to see.
I sort of began this question, I think, with an idea of imagination and the sort of limits of imagination. And it strikes me that one of the reasons we are sort of caught in this trap of thinking of emancipation as a stand-in for so many of the things is because of the limitations of history, the limitations of writing, the limitations of how we sort of conceive of these things. And I think, you know, history in particular is this discipline that is so focused on the event, right?
Yes.
It is focused on the thing that happens, and then you think about the lead up to that or the follow up from that, rather than, you know, say like the Annales School tried to think about mentalité, or Rinaldo in your work. I think you think of, I think the word you use is eruptions a couple times, right? This way in which these are not, this is not a logical progression. And the ways in which these are things that sort of pop up and that persist, that happen over time, right? And so I think maybe part of it is that sort of limitation. And so I guess what I want to ask next really builds on that, right? And asks, and I want to ask both of you, you know, how we actually go about interpreting this, right? How we actually go about having a sort of public face for all of this freedom seeking, right? And I'm gonna anchor this in a couple of examples, I guess. We are, of course, talking here sort of under the auspices of the Wallace Center for Arts and Reconciliation, a former plantation house and a former plantation that is trying to think about descendancy, is trying to think about repair of harms, right? Is trying to think about those things. But we are also living in, you know, in the past, I guess, 2 weeks or something ago in the States, Notting Way Plantation in Louisiana, a sort of archetype of another kind of interpretation, I guess, if we will, non-interpretation, forgetfulness, whatever we want to call it, right? Was burned to the ground. And so I don't know that I want to offer those as sort of poles or alternatives necessarily, but I think they're interesting as points of contrast. And I guess I just want to ask y'all, how do we go about both narrating and interpreting and preserving history that as y'all have been saying, right, is so complex and is not dictated by the sort of logic of events or chronology and those kind of things. So this is you know, this is a selfish question because it's something I'm always thinking about. But I would love to hear what y'all say to that. All right, who wants to start? Eliza Jane. Yeah.
Well, I want to elevate, as a descendant of a lynching victim, I think that it always, we should be in the mindset of thinking of those whose voices have been silenced, right? When we begin to do work of repair and reclamation. And in thinking in that spirit, I want to elevate heritage lynching, which is a term I have coined, which is the act of controlling and or terrorizing a community or an individual's cultural heritage, histories, narratives, both intangible and intangible. And so when we talk about Nottoway and we talk about Wallace, you're right. They are polar at polar ends of the spectrum, but they are on a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reminded and awakened. It's oddly enough, you elevate Nottoway. Look, you get in there, Dr. Gaddis, because I really wanted to speak to this because it awakened something in me, right, that was dormant. Because I think we have fallen into this myth of people are accepting what history of what history has told us. But we saw when Nottoway occurred, right, when this fire occurred, that there's a clear and stark disillusion as it pertains to so many fields, not just history, but so many fields as to where society, rests, right? And I want to draw into the apartheid between the Black experience, who are descendants of the enslaved, and those who are white descendants of obviously enslavers, right, in America. And if you look across social media platforms, the way that the burning of Nottoway resonated with those two communities was completely different, which truly means that there has not been any true form of reconciliation. And we even saw that with George Floyd. Whenever these events come to light, right, these watershed moments that highlight the remnants that are left from the period of enslavement, right? They showcase who we are in America. It showcases how Black folks are policed in even expressing how plantations make them feel, right? The notion of saying, I am happy that this place burned down. It was a site of trauma. I am disconnected from it. It's policed by the same folks who police their ancestors' bodies. Let's sit with that as we talk about emancipation. So in calling that into question, I myself, as a heritage conservationist and historian, right, public historian, I see the value in these spaces because these structures, these walls, they hold stories. Just like when you go to EJI and you see the bricks and you might see the one that they have that has the imprint, they tell a story. But there has to be a dialogue to contextualize that story for both parties, right? And when we talk about scenes of subjection, all of this is floating in my mind. And I kept thinking about, I was like, what is that quote that really sticks out for me? It's a woman from Alabama mentioning scenes of in Sadia Hartman's book. And she was interviewed in the WPA project, Works Progress Administration. Google it if you don't know about it. You should. It was an interview that they did, well, several interviews with various folks across the country who had been enslaved. And this woman was out of Alabama. Look, my tongue tied. Look, I'm feeling it, okay? And she said, slavery was a bad thing. And freedom of the kind we got, let's emphasize that, of the kind we got, with nothing to live on, was bad. 2 snakes full of poison. One lying with his head pointing north, the other with his head pointing south. Their names was slavery and freedom. The snake called slavery lay with his head pointed south, and the snake called freedom lay with his head pointed north. Both bit the nigger, and they both was bad. And so I think it goes back to this thing about we have to have dialogue and acknowledge it. And it can't just be a room full of the same folks having the same conversations, because we're preaching to the choir. We need to talk to those people who see places like Nottoway or see places like Wallace and think, I don't want to think about the enslaved bodies that helped cultivate this place, that helped hold this sacred ground, whose blood still speaks and cries right from the soil. I instead want to just appreciate the architecture and forget about what happened. Disillusion.
Yeah.
What Patricia said just now, disillusion. Go ahead, Rinaldo. I'll jump off my soapbox.
I actually want to pick up from something you said, Eliza, that I think is, the quote that you read from Sadia Hartman from WPA, formerly enslaved person, because it brilliantly stages, that quote brilliantly stages the ground for why today the problem of redress often termed reparations.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a difficult one to bring to the conversation and to bear out, but it also brilliantly stages the ground for why some Black people would celebrate seeing Norton Way burned to the ground.
Yes.
Um, that what stands in the wake of the post emancipation era for how we recognize that
Mm-hmm.
bad thing that happened
Mm-hmm.
is not necessarily the plantation house or the slave hut and its preservation, but
Mm-hmm.
it's what Black people are living right now today.
Right.
Lack of access to health care,
Mm-hmm.
education,
Mm-hmm.
proper food,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, economic security, and so on. The kinds of things that might become the foundation of an actual and real lived freedom.
Yes.
So, our celebration of not only burning to the ground is a repudiation of the idea that emancipation was indeed freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
it's a way of saying you
Mm.
continue to shackle us and
Yes.
tie us to a particular account of the past.
Yes.
As we had spoken informally prior to this conversation, we know that there's other evidence of slavery all around us that is not preserved as the plantation house.
Mm-hmm.
That we can walk down a street or a field and find a set of railroad tracks that appear to be going nowhere. And we know that's why, because that's where they were bringing out the sugar cane or the rice or what have you to get
Mm-hmm.
it to the port or to get it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
We know that we can go and find, you know, sometimes partially derelict mills. There's all kinds of evidence across North America and in the Caribbean where the landscape is littered with the detritus of
Yes.
slavery, and
Yeah.
it's not preserved as a plantation house for people to come and visit. It's not codified as a part of kind of national heritage.
Right.
It is simply there, and our people are still living intimately next to it.
Mm-hmm.
So every day we still live with the intimacy of transatlantic slavery and plantation slavery
Mm-hmm.
in the US and across the Caribbean and across the Americas. One of the things that I was doing in preparing for this conversation was thinking about the different dates and times in the Americas that people were quote unquote emancipated.
Mm-hmm.
And it ranges, it's still under 200 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the most recent is about 130 something years. That is not a long time. So, regardless of where one falls on the debates around reparations in the Caribbean and the US and so on, and I'm often a critic of the reparations movements, but what's crucial to understand is that the project of reparations, the project of redress, I think as Eliza was saying, is one that is not only left for the formerly enslaved, the defendants of the formerly enslaved to
Mm-hmm.
explain and to work out,
Mm-hmm.
but to really ask the question of whiteness and white people
Mm-hmm.
around how they understand their own self-making in this
Mm.
region.
Yes.
And they have to be able to understand and articulate their own self-making in this region for
Mm.
us to get to a place where a significant way of addressing reparations can really be approached.
Right.
And so, the demand has always been for even the legitimacy of reparations in that we explain ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case in relationship to whiteness. So last point I want to make here is, like, I've lived most of my life in North America, but I was born on a small island in the Caribbean, Barbados. And of course, at one point, almost the entire island of Barbados was plantations, sugarcane plantations in particular.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of plantations that have been preserved that are offered. You can go on tours of them. Um, Many of these plantations are still individually owned. by largely people from the UK, but the tours are ran and supported through the Barbados Heritage Trust, which is a kind of government agency. So it pays. If you listen to the narration of these tours, they talk about the enslaved on these plantations as workers. They don't say anything about where they came from, how they arrived there, right? And so this is a way of sanitizing, our difficult encounters. And, a reparations that's worth its weight is going to have to really be fully honest about our encounter. How did we end up in this place together? What are the stakes of how we ended up in this place together? And who's ultimately going to take responsibility for the brutality of that encounter and begin to unwind it? And so if white people and whiteness are not willing to look into the mirror and answer that question, we remain locked in a certain kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in which Black people remain continually at the bottom. And there's no more significant example to this in my mind than in Barbados. There's a plantation called Dratts Hall Estate, Dratts Hall Plantation. It has passed down through the Dratts family for at least 200 years or more. The current owner is a British MP with the same name, Richard Dratts. And at some point, the Barbados government was thinking that maybe they might expropriate this plantation. They have not done that as yet. But the fact that we live the immediacy of slavery, whether it's 137 years ago or 190 years ago, it is very immediate for Black people, even Black people who might want to deny it. It's immediate. We can walk out, if you go to a place like Tobago in the Caribbean, you can just walk out the street and you're walking next to the evidence of slavery, just like that. It's not preserved. It's not in the museum. It doesn't have a marker, and we know that this is also the case in the U.S. South.
Yeah. I'm seeing a bunch in the comments too about dialogue versus maybe story, right? I'm often really skeptical of like the efficacy of dialogue, right? As opposed to action, right? But you're both really making me think about this, about what dialogue actually means, right? I mean, I think we often use this sense of story, right? But one of the things that we don't often think about, right, is that story can be an imposition, right? It is one person telling another, right? And so I really appreciate how you and folks in the comments are sort of bringing in this notion of what it means to be in dialogue, right? What it means to actually meaningfully be in dialogue, both between Black and white, but also in dialogue with the sort of world around us, right? To actually think about what it looks like to think about and think with these sort of landscapes of slavery that we all of us who live in North America, or rather in the Americas, right, still sort of live within. So anyway, there's so much more here. I wish we had more time, but I do want to give each of you the last sort of word, and then I'm going to turn things back over to Ebony to sort of close us out. We titled this webinar "The Legacy or Legacies of Emancipation Today," and just really briefly for both of you to kind of close out, I wonder if you could say a sentence or two about what that means to you today, the legacy of emancipation or emancipation today. So whichever one of you wants to begin.
I'm going to close out with where my heart leads me, and that is the words of Assata Shakur as a liberation activist. It is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
I mean, how does one follow that? It's always such a powerful thing. But I want to say that, you know, there is a word that is still with us, and its potency and the establishment fear of it remains. That word grew in the bellies of the slave ships, and it continues to orient our politics today. It's abolition. Black people have worked for abolition since they were captured and placed in the hull of ships. And abolition does not simply mean abolition from enslavement. Abolition means a new order, a new account of how we might live together. So, you know, slave abolition began with slavery, but it's bigger than slavery, and we continue in the fight and the struggle for abolition to come into being.
That's beautiful. Thank you, both of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Ebony to close us out. Thank you both so much.
Thank you all so very much. Everybody in the comments box, please give our panelists the hugest round of applause. Please show them love. We're so very thankful to them. In 100 years, you'll be able to say you were on the first Wallace Center webinar, and that'll mean something to somebody. So what a riveting, beautiful conversation. We're just so very thankful that you took time out of your Friday to spend it with us. We're hopeful that this is the first of many, many webinars. It's just a great opportunity to get the Wallace family and friends who are around the country together in one space to have conversations, to share the perspectives of renowned experts like yourselves who maybe can't make it to Harpersville. Just being able to have you connected to our work, connected to our mission, is just it's so amazing. And in a world where social media and the internet kind of ruins everything, it's nice that it's doing something good here. So thank you. So again, thank you to our panelists. I'm just going to say a couple of words. Like I said at the beginning, the exhibit Out of Whole Cloth opens for the public on June 7th. We're having a public event on June 7th from 2 to 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I've just dropped a link to the registration in the chat if you would like to attend. If you don't want to attend, or you can't attend, or you don't live in Alabama, but you just want to learn more about the Wallace Center, please visit wallacearts.org and learn more about our work. You can join our listserv. We would love to send you all kinds of stuff to just educate you about the things that we're doing, and just be on the lookout for more webinars. And again, we're so very thankful for all of you all coming, and we'll see you on the internet. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Guys, so I just ended the stream. Okay, Rinaldo's like it's Friday. Deuces. Thank you all so much. That was so good. I'm so happy.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Oh, wait, I haven't ended the stream.